Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and just a reminder to subscribe to my podcasts, Web Dev 101 and Data Nation, over there on either Spotify, iTunes, wherever. And make sure to like this video and subscribe. But what we're going to be talking about today is images, image tags, how to work with images using HTML and CSS. So this is not like an end-to-end everything you could possibly do, but this should give you a pretty solid idea of how to accomplish most things with images using HTML and CSS. So I got a nice little scratch board here with just an index CSS and a JS file. Okay, the JavaScript, the index HTML has the link tag and script tag to connect those CSS and JavaScript files. To confirm that, I have the page open using Live Server. Again, so I could right click on the file and open with Live Server. Again, Live Server is an extension from VS Code, so you can just download that and use that as a way to basically create a run-of-the-mill server, web server in any folder that you're working out of. So I have this open, and right now there's nothing in here, so you can see that the body is empty. So how do I make an image in HTML? It's pretty straightforward. You use an image tag. Okay, now an image tag is one of the few tags in HTML that doesn't require a closing tag. So again, most tags, they have an opening tag and a closing tag with a slash. Image tags, like most input tags, don't need a closing tag. So you could, but a good habit is to always put the little closing slash in that opening tag. So that way it's a self-closing tag. That way when you switch over to using things like React where you have to put that slash, you're already kind of used to it. Now you notice I still see no picture. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go grab a picture of the grimace from McDonald's. So you know the grimace. Assuming the grimace was part of your childhood as it was mine. Okay, unless I've gotten too old where the grimace is not a thing anymore. But you know, age happens. But okay, so basically what I want to do is I want to tell the image and I want to give it a source. That's a source attribute, because again, whenever you have these like, you know, thing equals something inside an HTML tag, these are referred to as attributes, and they tell the HTML tag to do things beyond just its standard default behavior. So source basically tells the image tag what picture should show up where this image is. So I put the URL there, and then we should see the grimace appear. And see, there it is. I'm loving it. Okay, so that's how an image tag fundamentally works. But there's a second thing you want to do to make for a couple different benefits, and that's add an alt tag, an alt attribute. So in another attribute we're going to add is called alt, and I want to say alt equals, and we'll just say like picture of the grimace from McDonald's. Okay, and now the purpose of this alt tag does two things for us. It's going to provide us with accessibility for people who are visually impaired, because they're going to use screen readers, and screen readers won't know what the picture is of. Okay, but they'll read the alt tag, and the alt tag can provide them a description of the picture and some context around the picture. Okay, and same thing with like search engine web crawlers. They can't see the picture, so they don't know what the picture is and what the point of it is on your website. So they're going to use the text of your alt tags to kind of be able to tell, like, okay, what is the context of this on your web page, to determine like how it's going to treat it for search engine purposes. So bottom line is good accessibility is good SEO, because generally the things you do to make your website more accessible to people who are like visually and audibly impaired are things that are actually going to make it easier for the engine crawlers to be able to better understand your website as well, because a web crawler cannot see or hear. Okay, so you're providing them with that text context that's going to help them be able to semantically understand your website. Cool. So that's like the minimum. So right there, I now have an image. Now notice that an image, well, this is kind of big, and I kind of want it smaller. So one thing I can do is I could also add a width attribute and say, hey, I only want this thing to be 200 pixels. Okay, and I only want it to be height 200 pixels. I can add these properties in here, or these attributes, and yeah, so you like, it'll make the image 200 by 200. But notice it's kind of warped. Generally, you don't want to do this here. You generally don't want to use the width and height attributes right on the HTML tag, mainly because you generally want to have these kind of more aesthetic things done via your CSS. Okay, so we're going to have that back that way. But we want to target this thing, and we want to be able to target it individually. So a good way to do that is to give it an ID. So I'm going to give this an ID attribute and say the ID of this is the grimace. So that way it's just easy to identify in my CSS. Okay, only one tag can have the same ID. So that's like the best thing about an ID, that it's a unique identifier. I'm saying this particular element I refer to as the grimace. So now in my CSS file, I can target it by saying, the grimace. The hash is what denotes it as an ID. So I'm targeting any element that has an ID of the grimace. That's what this means. Okay, and now I could add my width and height properties inside the CSS rule. So I can say 200 pixels here, height 200 pixels. Okay, so that way all my rules as far as like aesthetics are in my CSS, separated from sort of like the content of the website, is just less cluttered, and separation of concerns. So anything that has to do with how things look, I have here. Anything to do with what is over here in my HTML. Cool. So height and width. Now this still looks a little like not good because of it's being warped. Because by default, there's a property called object fit. Okay, this determines like how the object fits within that space you've designated. By default, it's going to do contain. So it's just going to scrunch up that picture into that spot, make it fit there. Okay, that's if the picture's too big. If the picture's too small, it'll just kind of not fill up the whole space. Then you have fill, which would do the opposite, where like if the picture's too small, it'll fill up the space, but it'll warp the dimensions. But what if I want to fill the whole space, but I don't want to warp it? Then what I can do is do a cover. What a cover does, it'll either shrink or expand the image and make it fill the spot, but not in a warped way. So you might be cutting off some of the edges, it might crop it a little bit, but overall you get the right aspect ratio. So see it looks good. And to make this even look a little bit more aesthetic, I might want to round the corners. The way you do that is you do like a border radius. Border radius. And I can say, hey, 10 pixels. Okay, and that's going to give me like a nice little rounded corners, but I can go like 180 pixels and make that like a full circle. And see, now I have a circle with the grimace. So oftentimes you'll see that on like a founder's page or staff page of a website where you see like all the people who work for the company, and they all have like that circle with their picture, and it's like, wow, how they got those, all of them matching. It's because oftentimes a lot of that's done in the CSS, not the actual images themselves. Okay, so that way you don't have to worry about like the size of the image and all this stuff. You just say, hey, everything's 200 by 200. They're all going to be in a circle with a border radius. Wonderful. Another cool thing you can do with it, now actually before we get to like filters, one thing to be aware of is that images are inline. Okay, what does that mean? Everything in HTML or in every HTML element is either an inline element, which means it's going to be the same as text. So notice if I write text here, see, it's all part of the same line. Okay, so literally like the picture is treated like just like as another letter that I wrote in this line of text. That's inline content. There's also block elements, which are mostly like containers, like divs and section tags and whatnot. Okay, now block elements, they get their own space. Now by default, again, an image is inline. So that means if I generally wanted to center it, it would be the technically it's text in its container, the container being the body tag. So you can see here's the image, and then here's the body. Okay, so basically if I wanted to center the stuff inside there, I would target the body tag and say text align center, and that'll center all the text content in that block. But what if I really wanted the grimace to be sort of like below the text or above the text? I want it to be its own row of content. Then I would want to make it a block, and I can change something from inline to block and from block to inline if I want to. I just would do display, and that changes the display of that particular element to whatever I want. In this case, I want it to be a block. And you see now the grimace takes up its own row, but it's no longer centered. So how do I center a block? Because it's different than text. It's no longer all the inline content in the body is still centered. I see the text is still centered, but this is not inline content, it's a block. So to center a block, what you do is you use a margin, and you set the margin to auto, and what that does, it creates a margin that perfectly centers the content or that block. Okay, and so see, we have the grimace right there. It's all nice and centered. Cool. Now, what I could also do is I can use this property called a filter. Now, a filter has a lot of different properties to it. So there's all these functions you can use to alter this image. So something like brightness. So brightness 100% would just mean just as bright as it is now. So that's not going to really change anything. Okay, but if I change this to like 150% brightness, See, now the picture looks a lot brighter. If I make this 10% brightness, it's going to look really dark. Okay, or I can make this like 70% dark. And that could be useful if you want to like take like a background image and you want to make it darker so you can put some like light text over it or something like that. Then there is grayscale. And again, if I do 100%, it's going to be black and white. If I do like 5%, it's going to just be like a little closer to black and white, not enough so much you can tell. Let's say 50%. See, the color is a little bit more muted, but not all the way there. You kind of see the differences. So these different like filters allow you to change the image. So you not only can I like change the shape of the image using the border radius and kind of create that like circular shape. I could also put a border on it, but I'm not going to do that now. But a cool thing you can do with a filter is we can make it like animate. Now, if you want to go into full-blown animations, I recommend watching my videos on CSS animations because there's a lot to it. But the simplest thing you can do is called a transition. So if I add this transition property, so I do like 0.37, well, let's do filter. That's the property that I say, hey, when this property changes, like if something happens that causes this to change, don't just go from A to B, like transition to it, like make it smooth. So I'm going to say, hey, make that transition occur over 3 seconds. So what I'll do is I'll do another rule for the grimace that says, you know, this is for when you hover over the grimace. So if you hover your mouse over it, this thing will get triggered and it'll make a change. And we're going to apply a filter of grayscale, and we'll do 100%. So now if I hover my mouse over the grimace, see, it turns black and white. Okay, so there's cool things you can do, like images. You can have a lot of fun with that. Okay, and you know, we could also add a border to it if we really wanted to. So like border, we'll say like 3 pixels dash 3 pixels solid. Let's just do it this way, 3 pixels. I want to take a look at the types of lines. 3 pixels dotted. And we'll say gray. Okay. Oh, forgot to put that there. That's why I was having a problem. Okay, you see there, it puts a little border. But again, maybe I want that border to transition. So what I'll do is I'll do border, and then we'll do 0.3 seconds on that as well. So that way they both kind of ease in. There we go. So see, that's kind of a little neat effect there. Now let's talk about like positioning. What if I wanted to like position like 2 pictures on top of each other? So let's get another picture. Let's get the Hamburglar in there. Hamburglar. There's the Hamburglar. So let's inject the Hamburglar in here. So let's do another image. And if I'm using VS Code, you can use Emmet in your HTML files right away. So I could actually, instead of typing it out just like I just did, I could be like image and then put like square brackets and say like source equals, and then put that, and then I can just do another one for like the alt equals Hamburglar, and there we go. Okay, and now I have my HTML tag all nice and done up for me. So Emmet's a really cool tool. I have a video on Emmet if you want to see me go more in depth about how to use Emmet when you're writing HTML. Okay, actually I should have given it an ID as well, so I'll give it an ID of Hamburglar. So we can target that as well. So now if I take a look at this, we have the 2 images, but see, that doesn't look so nice. So I'm going to want to apply this property, so I can just do a comment and say, hey, also target the Hamburglar as well. And we'll put the hover on both of them, so we'll put like the Hamburglar hover. Okay, so now if I hover over either of them, I get that nice effect. Okay, how cool is that? Okay, but sometimes you might want to do like an overlapping effect. So the way you would do that is you're going to use a position property. Okay, now what position does is that instead of like them, you basically remove them from the normal way that like HTML figures out like where it should belong. And you're saying, hey, I'm going to tell you exactly where this thing should go. So I say position, and I can either choose fixed or absolute. Absolute means it is going to start from this pixel over here, so the very top right of the page, regardless of what content's on the page. If I say fixed, it's from the top of the container. So they're both in the body right now, so that's still going to end up being this corner here. But let's say they were inside of a div that was like over here, then relative would be like the top corner of that div. Okay, so the idea is like when you say, hey, this is where they're located, relative to what? Relative to the top corner, that'd be absolute. Relative to the top corner of the current container that they're in, then that's going to be relative, just depending on what you're trying to do. Okay, so I'm going to do absolute. Okay, actually, I think I meant to do fixed. Fixed is what I'm talking about. Fixed. Okay, now notice they both disappeared. Okay, notice like well, now they didn't both disappear, but that looks like the grimace disappeared. The grimace is still technically there, but because since I gave them both a fixed position, they both start in the upper right corner, like the upper right corner of where they could be. Okay, and they're both going to be right on top of each other. And the way HTML do is just literally going to slap them like pancakes. So when you imagine like pancakes, you know, the first pancake's on the bottom. And like if you read the HTML, who came first? Well, I see that the grimace came first. So since the grimace came first, that's the first pancake, and then the hamburger is the next pancake, so that got stacked on top. So I could change the order that my stuff is written in my HTML, but that just seems like tedious. What you can do is you can specify where in the stack they are. By default, everything's assumed to have a priority of 1. The higher the number, the higher up on the pancake stack they are. So if I wanted to bring up the grimace and put the grimace on top, what I would do is I would just go target the grimace by itself and say use z-index. Z-index kind of tells you where you want to be in the pancake stack. So I'm going to give it 2, so that way it's higher priority than 1, and see now grimace is on top. Okay, and now maybe I want to move, since grimace, again, we have that position fixed, maybe I want to move grimace a little bit to the left. So now I can do like starting from the left, so starting from the left edge of the screen, I want to move the grimace 150 pixels. And see now I got that effect. And so you get this kind of cool effect as I bounce between the two. Okay. Now working with fixed and relative positions can kind of give you cool effects like this, but they can also be really tricky to work with when it comes to responsive design because you're fixed. So it's not necessarily going to move it perfectly as you adjust the screen. You can use percentages, but percentages can also be tough to get them to work consistently. So beware if you want to do these like layered effects. Keep in mind like some of the challenges you may have in trying to come up with like the responsiveness of the page at different screen sizes, which is why again most websites nowadays are like single column like designs because they're really easy to make responsive. The more columns you have, the harder it is like the transition from like desktop to mobile. Or at least there's more work you have to do with like a nice one single column design that just really translates really well to mobile. So then you can really kind of have one design that just kind of works in many different outlets. But I think that gives you a pretty good idea of like how images work and the things you can do with images. Of course, you can then grab those images in JavaScript and change all the things that we talked about. So that way, like they change because you clicked on a button or something like that. But yeah, that's images. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.